Hi there, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak on a major trend in foreign policy and how I would first explain that, and then secondly, advise and recommend senior managers at Global Affairs respond to it. There are any number of things that one could select in today's world, but I think I would highlight the current move away from multilateralism. And really, I think that impacts all of Canada's foreign policy priorities. But the two that I will highlight in my response are our collaboration on pursuing the rules-based order and on alleviating poverty. So on the rules-based order, I think that the move away from multilateralism makes the world a more unpredictable place. So traditional alliances that we have looked to in the context of the multilateral world simply don't exist anymore. And so it's much more complex and challenging for Canada to advance its interests globally. In that sense, and traditional partners then having lost a bit of the fabric between traditional powers, then it's less conventional partners that come to the fore in terms of how Canada can look to advance its interests. So a good example of this would be the situation in Venezuela, and neither the UN nor the Organization of American States were capable of creating an environment whereby a constructive conversation around the reestablishment of democracy in Venezuela could take place. And so the Lima Group was struck, Canada being a leader in that, as a way to have that conversation. So I think the move away from multilateralism, it's also worth mentioning that this does create space for the emergence of populist leaders. And in a sense, it's mutually reinforcing because the populist leaders then tend to turn away from the multilateral structures and fora. And obviously that weakens these institutions. And the rules-based order. And so I mentioned then the second impact would be on development. And similarly to the diplomatic partners, traditional donors are gravitating in some cases away from space that they've previously occupied. And I think we've seen this for some time, but certainly in the case of COVID, there are such heavy pressures for countries to address their own domestic situations that we're seeing much more focus on internal dynamics and maybe a little bit less appetite to support internationally and some of the development needs that exist previously, but also as a result of COVID. And so with this new space being created, there are certain non-traditional partners that are occupying space. And as they're not necessarily committed multilateralists or multilateral partners, there's new foreign policy interests that are being advanced in those spaces and new alliances that are maybe not necessarily aligned with where Canada would like to see certain conversations moving and certain issues evolving. And it also this is also creating in the development sector, but also around the rules-based order, as I mentioned, a bit more unpredictability and a little bit of a different influence map. So as far as how I would communicate this to senior management, I think this is going to sound a bit contradictory, but I think the first point that I would make is that it's really important for Canada to have a bit of a new approach in terms of being very issue-based. So if we can't count on certain partners always being reliable to stand up beside us because we're Canada and they are an established partner, then we need to really look at what the issues are that we're seeking to advance and which partners for that given interest and issue are aligned. And I think this is an excellent example of where diplomacy will be more important than ever because information on the ground, intelligence from partners is going to be key in helping identify who our allies are on a given issue. And I think an example of where we find this issue-based alliance building and thinking could be, for example, the the foreign minister's COVID task force that's been struck just since this spring. And it's a key group of countries that are interested in addressing issues across the board that relate to the impact that COVID is having on their countries and in their regions. Everywhere from development assistance to supply chains to vaccine development, you name it. And so I think that is, we see some non-traditional partners there. We have Peru, we have Turkey, we have Morocco, and that may be an emerging and effective way of looking at how we advance Canadian interests, and should be something, a lens through which we look at strategy around advancing Canadian interests. Now, in saying that about things being issue-based, I think it's also really important, and I would advise senior managers that it's really important at the same time to see the interconnectedness of issues, because none of what we're doing is happening in a vacuum. So political decisions are connected to global trade, and global trade is connected to consular. And I think an excellent example of where we see that is in the China discussion around the Meng case, and which on one side seems like a trade issue and a bilateral discussion between the US and Canada in terms of the extradition of this Chinese national. But it isn't, and we're seeing it's very much connected to a very high-profile case of two Canadians that are being held in China. So obviously, when we're looking at our policy and our interaction and engagement, how we're advancing certain interests in one priority area, we absolutely need to take into account that there will be indirect and sometimes very direct consequences and considerations that we need to be taking into account as we're calibrating our response. And I think another point to maybe be made about interconnectedness is that we see certain things through our lens, and we have legislation around Canadian development assistance, for example, that prohibits us from tied aid, and that is a very basic Canadian approach to development assistance. It's not at all how other countries operate, and it's not often how other countries see our development assistance programming. And so, of course, we will take the Canadian approach where that's concerned, but it's key to recognize that partners may see that as a tool for advancing certain Canadian interests, and so it shouldn't be considered in a vacuum nor implemented in a vacuum, because it will feed into to larger discussions. I think a couple other things that I would mention to senior managers, and quite frankly, I think a lot of these things are things that they would already be considering, but when we're developing Canadian policy, really important to recognize that as we're advancing Canadian values, that will not be aligned with all partners around the world. And we will find ourselves in conflict in some cases with the policies and the values of other countries, and that can be okay. So it's really, really important to recognize that we can't water down, we can't change fundamental Canadian values, and it may lead to conflict, and we need to be prepared for that. And a final point is just that we really should review the state of globalization. There really, has been in the past a move with trade, with multilateralism, towards a more globalized world, and we may be seeing the pendulum swing back a little bit in that regard. We may see more protectionism. We see some now, and the impact of COVID across the board will be encouraging us all to look inward a little bit. I mentioned supply chains earlier, and of course that's something that every country is concerned about. So in the trade conversation, we may be seeing countries turning inward, and we need to be prepared to respond to that. So all that to say, the significant trend, as I mentioned, the move away from multilateralism will have broad impact across the board on our priorities, in particular on the rules-based order and development programming. But there are several steps that the Canadian government can take to develop more insightful and well-considered policy around responding to that in the future. Thank you.